Hello everyone and welcome back. I have done a lot of tailoring in my day, and that means that I have done a lot of buttonholes. And the vast majority of the ones that I have done, since I usually work in the 18th and 19th centuries, have been done by hand sewing, rather than using the machine to run the buttonhole stitches or using machine to do something like a welted style. So I have spent a lot of years trying to get better at this, and have probably done, I don't know, a few hundred, if not a few thousand at this point. And I get a lot of requests on how to improve, because they seem to be very complex things, and figuring out how to match up your thread and your underlayers and the stitches and all sorts of things can be really confusing. So today I'm going to be covering the steps that I take to make hand-stitched buttonholes. And we're going to be going through not only the basic stitches, but I'm going to be taking you through all the variations that I think work and some that I don't think work, different threads, different layering, different options, why some things are really important and other things you can kind of get away with. First, though, I want to show you some of the antique garments that I have in my collection. I have recently been acquiring a lot of tailored pieces, and that means I have a lot of examples to show you. Some are going to be messier than others. Don't think the ultimate goal is perfection here, because there is a wide range that you're going to see on these different garments. Some are very spaced out, some are very uneven. It all depends on the fabric and the thread that they're working with as to how small and dainty or how large and chunky these things need to be. So we're going to start by looking at the different examples, and then we'll head upstairs to the studio to get working on all the different varieties that I can show you. Honestly, the most important thing when it comes to making really good hand-stitched buttonholes is your thread options. There are so many different types that you can use. There are some that I recommend and some that I don't recommend. So let's start with the good ones. This is basting thread, and this specifically is different from regular thread in the fact that it breaks really easily. And it's meant to just hold your layers together temporarily and remove really easily. So I will always take the opportunity to remind people this is your friend. Baste all of your things together. Most of the work you're going to do in buttonholes is in silk. This is a 50 weight silk. It is the lightest weight one that you usually find, and it is not good for obviously doing knots and things like that. It is way too fine for that, but it is really good for anything where you want visible stitching, and you will see me use it to whip around the edges of the buttonhole to keep it from fraying before we start doing the major stitching. These are 30 weight silk, which is the next weight up. It is considered a top stitching weight, and this is actually my preferred thread for most of my buttonholes unless I'm working with a heavier fabric. So it is relatively lightweight, and you will have to put more knots and stitches into your buttonholes in order to get them to be as dense as you want them to be, but I find that this tends to make for a more finessed look than heavier weights. Moving up, we have what is known as button twist, and this is something that is definitely recommended for doing buttonholes, and it does a really beautiful, wonderful buttonhole as well. It is just going to be a little bit on the heavier side. It means things will be faster, but they will be a little bit chunkier. And it's also particularly wonderful for stitching on buttons or anything where you need a lot of strength to it. Any silk won't do, just because there are some silks that are meant for more machine sewing and lightweight stitching. This is fine to hand stitch with, but if you're going to be doing buttonholes, this is just not dense enough. It is not thick enough. You're gonna have a really big struggle with this one. I've generally found most of the embroidery silks are either spun too loosely or not the right weight. So for example, these two Krennics, we have the silk Bella, which is a little bit too lightweight, and it honestly snaps pretty easily if you're trying to do a long length for buttonholes. And this one, the silk Serica, is a little too heavy in my opinion. It would be okay in a pinch, but it doesn't really give an ideal look. I do, however, use it in place of a cord or gimp in order to give some more elevation to the buttonhole sometimes, as you'll see. Speaking of silk cords and gimps, they come in different weights. The ones that you usually find from antique dealers can often be a little bit heavier weight, such as these two. They're really meant more for trim than for buttonholes, but they can work as well depending on how prominent of a style you want. One of my particular favorites is the more modern silk gimp. It is a little bit lighter weight and therefore is a pretty appropriate approximation to what you find historically. It is a little softer. And all of these are just a cotton-based thread that is wrapped with silk around it. So these aren't something you can actually stitch with, but you can lay it down and work over it. We also shouldn't forget linen thread, though I will generally say you shouldn't use linen thread for most purposes when it comes to buttonholes if you are working on linen, such as doing a shirt or shift or other basic undergarment or some sort of linen garment. You might want linen thread for that rather than silk. This is a heavyweight 35-2. This would work on a midweight sort of linen. If you're doing undergarments, you might want something a little bit lighter weight than this. We should also take a brief moment for why I don't recommend most of the more commercially available things. The heavy dual duty thread is just too fine in my opinion, and if you go heavier with the button and craft thread or with the jeans top stitching thread, they get really stiff really quickly. So I will show you an example done in this sort of thread, but it just doesn't come out looking quite as nice. They will work in a pinch. If this is all you have available to you, it's okay. Just know that if the buttonhole doesn't come out looking really beautiful like an antique, it's not your fault. Also of note is thread length. Obviously when you're doing a buttonhole, ideally you do the whole buttonhole with one strand of thread. May not always be possible, and I will show you how to connect. But I usually measure out about a yard for a 1-inch buttonhole out of the lighter weight thread, maybe slightly less for the heavier button twist. This is something that you will find varies based off of how tight your stitches are, the size of your thread, how chunky your fabric is, all sorts of different features. I also want to note the fact that silk thread does come in spools or on cards, and if you are working with the ones on cards, they will have these little folds and kinks in them. These are going to be a little bit of a difficulty when you're doing your stitching just because they have a propensity towards knotting up and curling in on themselves a little bit more. Run it through your fingernails to straighten it out a bit before you get started, or even iron your thread. I generally don't recommend waxing silk thread purely because it will get darker when you add heat. So if you ever want to iron your garments, be careful with your beeswax around silks. This is the buttonhole that I'm going to be using as my example base today. It's not the prettiest one I've ever done, but it'll have to do. So you may have noticed that it is a keyhole shape. There are two different shapes that we tend to see most often, either this keyhole with the little hole at the end that does look like it is meant for a key, or one that is just straight across. This particular style is more popular from the late 19th century onwards, particularly when it comes to tailored items, and the straight across one is more common earlier, as well as on undergarments and the like. So different styles, it's up to you. As for the rest of this buttonhole, we're going to break down all of the choices that I made to get to this point, starting with the fact that it has a layer of canvas in between. It doesn't matter what your exterior fabric or your lining or interior facing is, but you want something to stabilize. In this case, it is just a linen canvas, the type that is used in tailoring, but I also highly recommend a beaded linen for this. It's very stiff, it's very lightweight. It will help stabilize the buttonhole and make the process much, much easier, so you'll want to have something behind it. Most of the time, there's usually a long strip that runs the whole way of the garment, And in the case of lighter weight things like shirts, shifts, that sort of thing, we'll get into that later, but you won't need it there. So that's the first important step. You might also notice that I have basting stitches running all the way around all of these buttonholes. Once you've marked everything out, I recommend doing some sort of stitch to hold everything together. Sometimes if I'm in a rush, I'll use straight pins, but your threads can catch on those and it's just really frustrating. So definitely take the time to do all of the basting to hold everything into place, and the layers won't shift around as you go. Next up, we need to cut open the buttonhole. I have a tendency to use my little snips for this. They do make buttonhole scissors, which means that you can actually insert the fabric completely and the blade doesn't start till about 1/4 or 3/8 of an inch in. I do really love my buttonhole snips as well, but they are a little more expensive and absolutely unnecessary unless you're doing a lot of buttonholes. So most of the time I just use a very sharp, strong pair of snips, which is a very useful tool in your arsenal. And I start by inserting it at the very end and clipping through. You want to make sure that it's not twisting to one side or the other. The layers are staying stable. I like to pinch on one side to make sure that they aren't shifting as I go, because you don't want the opening to be uneven. In fact, one of the other tools you can use is a chisel. So buttonhole chisels will just go straight through and then you're sure that all of your layers will be even. If you're going to be doing a keyhole buttonhole, this is the point where you want to cut out a little diamond or punch a little circle down at the end. Again, they do make punches that are meant just for keyhole buttonholes, but I usually just cut a little diamond. So starting about 1/8 of an inch away from the end, cut on either side there, cut up to the point, and then I kind of clean out the space. You might find a few stragglers, and if you turn to the back, you might find the back is not nearly as trimmed as the front is, especially if you've got thicker fabrics or fabrics that are prone to fraying like this wool is. You can see I've already got a few threads that are trying to come loose. Go ahead and trim at those. But once I have something that looks like a fairly clean round opening, we're good to go to the next step. Since this fabric is prone to fraying, and frankly most fabrics are, and you're also working with multiple layers, it's good to start off by whipping over the edges. So we're not going to be using knots in our thread for any of this. That gets really bulky really quickly. Instead, what I want you to do is start off by anchoring the thread to the fabric. It's essentially a reverse of when you're finishing your thread at the end. So we're going to start off with a tail that gets buried. I usually like to run the length of the button because this will then get stitched over and be extra secure. I take a small stitch, biting into usually the canvas layer just a little bit, right underneath there, and pull tight. If I start to feel like it's moving a little bit, I can take a second stitch or sort of loop through that previous one that I just did. It sort of knots it off. It's really stable at this point. And we're going to come up, try to place where I'm exiting about as wide as my buttonhole should be to start. If you're finding that you have trouble keeping a clean, consistent line the whole way around, it is okay to go ahead and mark with a pencil or chalk where that line needs to go. I generally don't do this purely because sometimes that line will end up visible, and I'd prefer it to not be. I've gotten pretty good at staying consistent over the years. So we're going to start off by pulling apart. You can see I've already got a few threads that are trying to escape at this point, and come up just a little bit further from that first stitch and whip over the edge. And this will also get you some practice in terms of how you need to hold this in order to get the buttonhole stitching done. So we're just trying to catch as many of those threads as we can, keep everything from escaping, trying to not go past where the buttonhole will actually need to be stitched. You go too wide and it'll start to show, you go too narrow and it will pull out. This will also tell you how narrow you can go with your buttonhole stitch before it becomes a problem. So this is a good little test as well. So you can see we've gotten down to that one end, and we're going to turn and start to rotate around the keyhole. And for the last stitch, just come through the center and anchor on the back. I don't tend to do a lot of work to anchor down the thread simply because this is all going to get stitched over, so I just bury it underneath where all the stitches will be with long. Next up, we're going to start with our thread for actually doing the buttonhole. I'm using a heavier button twist for this one just because it makes it a little more clear and obvious what we're doing. But just like the whip stitch, we start on the back on this left side of the buttonhole, and I will anchor about 1/4 inch or more, starting off there, run until the tail just disappears. And just like before, take a little bite. And like I said, if you want to anchor it more, you can go through that loop. It creates a really stable knot on the back. Come up, making sure to start at the appropriate width. We don't want to go too wide or too narrow. And the buttonhole stitch is a particular stitch. It's not just any knotted stitch. The blanket stitch is different from the buttonhole stitch, for example. And there's a few ways that you can do this. My preferred method is to loop around, essentially creating a circle, and then stitch through the middle of that circle. So then I will go down through the open slit. I generally will kind of insert where it's open pretty far at the top and slide my needle down as far as it needs to go. And then I will push this direction, so that way my needle comes up pretty straight, less at an angle, more straight up towards me. And then I will pull and make sure that these aren't folding and knotting in some weird way, especially with the stuff that's come off of cards. You want to make sure that it stays clear. And then we will start to slowly tie that knot, and we'll lift up and aim right for your forehead. You don't want to go off to the side. I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. Instead, you want to continue to do that knot and bring it towards the top. If you find that the thread that's under here is sitting too far up, it's okay to kind of tug on things a little bit, make sure that it's staying even. That is something to keep track of as you go, making sure that you are spacing things out evenly. Now, the most important thing about spacing is to make sure that your knots are spaced correctly. It's not a matter of covering every single bit of the fabric, so much as making sure that your knots are the correct distance apart. So the bigger your knots, the further apart they're going to need to be. So though it may be tempting to use the biggest thread possible, that just means you're going to have to do fewer threads because they're going to have to be further apart because bigger knots. I know some people who prefer to put the needle through first and then throw the thread around, but I find that I get confused when doing this simply because I have to stop and let go of the needle and actually move the thread and remember what direction I'm supposed to move the thread, and if you end up wrapping the wrong part of the thread, you end up with a different knot. So I find it's just much more consistent to just simply do that little circle and stitch through the center of the circle. That way I know that I have the right wrap of the thread before I get started, otherwise I'll end up with a different knot. For example, we do end up wrapping that direction instead. Find that we get a much less pronounced knot. I also find that this will want to pull to the side, so I find it really hard to keep that line consistent because it keeps wanting to pull the opposite direction. You can see there's a little curve happening very quickly there. So that's a blanket stitch where you basically are just going through your loop. So that's better suited towards the edge rather than what the style is we're looking for here. As I get down to the end here, if I'm going to be doing a curve around the end instead of a bar tack, or if it's a keyhole style, we're going to start splaying out our stitches. Again, it's most important that the knots are placed correctly and spaced well rather than the threads themselves. So you won't have a solid line of stitches around any sort of curve like this. And you might notice that my thread is getting kind of short. The next step is to show you how to deal with a thread that is too short or broken. So it is pretty simple. All we're going to do is take this and move it towards the back, flip it over, and I'm going to insert this just about where I would if I was taking another stitch, but instead of going straight through, I'm just going to lay it down where the rest of my threads are going to go. So it's going to sandwich between the layers, running about that distance to make sure that it stays anchored. I know this is going to sound weird, but I'm going to leave it loose. I promise it'll be okay. I usually cut just a little bit beyond that hole and rethread. Just like we did before, we're going to start, actually going to lay these essentially side by side by running the tail and making a little loop. This is also a good reason why we are not using big knots, because that'd be really obvious in the middle of a buttonhole. So we've anchored our thread. We're going to come up where we would for that next stitch, just like if it was connected. But instead of starting our stitches, the first thing we're going to do is find this previous thread. It's a little bit harder where it's curved like this, admittedly. It's a little more obvious when they're sitting upright, but you're looking for these threads. You're looking for the ones that are continuing underneath. And all you need to do is stitch through that from this direction back towards. So we're just going to grab that little loose thread, because if you pull on it really hard, it will come undone. We're not going to do that just yet, but we're just going to stitch through that, right? We're not going through a loop or anything like that. We're just stitching back towards our stitch. We're going to lift up and put a little bit of tension on it, and it will pop into place and give you some of the slack that you have on that previous thread and give you the knot that you've been using the whole way through. So now we can continue like it never even happened. And worst case, even if you do have a break there, it's usually not too obvious, but just catching, anchoring that little thread to begin with on the previous thread makes a big difference in the consistency and the continuity of the buttonhole. So even if you can't manage to get that knot, if your thread broke way too close, it's okay. You'll also find as you go around these curves that your knots will slide towards the middle. That's okay. Once we get back to the straight, we're going to start trying to right that. Once we get down to the very end and our last knot is butted up against the end there, we're just going to go through the slit, come up right next to it, and we're going to usually take 2 or 3 tacks at the end, just whipping around. This will mean that we prevent anything from splitting open, no matter how much stress the buttonhole is under. And then generally you take a couple more stitches with the buttonhole stitch over those 2 threads. I've managed to not leave quite enough thread to do that easily. So definitely a lesson in making sure that you've cut your thread well enough. If I was stuck in this position on my actual buttonhole, I probably wouldn't bother to do much with it. You can honestly leave these bar tacks as is, but I can also do some loops and come back up and sort of fake that little buttonhole knot if I need to. Usually you do 2 or 3 down here at the bottom just to hold everything together. And then you'll go back to the back side and anchor your thread off. And there we have our buttonhole. So what happens if we don't have any sort of canvas behind our buttonhole? Well, it will do all right. It's less that you can't make a nice buttonhole if you don't have canvas, it's more just risky. Part of it is the fact that it is much softer as you're handling it. It's not going to have the same resistance and stability, so it means that as you're working, everything's a lot squishier, and therefore it's a lot harder to actually be consistent with where you're coming up with your needle, with making sure that you have the movements correct and consistent. Everything is moving more than you want it to be. More importantly, it means that you might have to take a larger bite. So the actual depth of the buttonhole might need to be a little further, because the risk of your fabric pulling out and fraying as you go is a lot higher. Especially if you have a looser weave, it's hard to get really close to the edge. And if you have some sort of linen behind it, beaded linen, canvas, any sort of interfacing that isn't going to fray, that isn't chunky and likely to come apart, it can be the resistance that you need in order to make sure that you have a nice narrow buttonhole. It also means that you're less at risk for waviness. That means if you overpack on one side, you may get a warp like that. It wants to essentially stay open. It doesn't want to hang out in a straight line. I'm trying to pull it straight, but it doesn't want to. It wants to curve, and that is what we're trying to avoid, especially long term. As this thing gets used and moved around a lot, buttoned and unbuttoned, it's going to end up pretty lopsided, pretty warped, not really sticking to the straight line of what we want, as opposed to something that is made the same way with the layer of canvas in between. And even though we pull and tug on this one, it still comes out pretty straight, and a little bit of push there and it just goes right back to what it was. So ideally you want something that's going to have the resistance to hold up to a lot of usage. This is what happens when you pull sideways. As you can see, the knots sit off to the side of the opening there rather than on top. And I promise this is the same amount of bite, meaning the needle started the same amount of distance in, as this one. When we compare the two buttonholes made out of the same thread, you can see this one, though it's the same width of bite, looks so much narrower and honestly looks a little bit cleaner. Because of the knots being off to the side, the width is just so much chunkier, and on top of that it doesn't actually sit closed and flat because there's extra width there that we didn't actually take away when we just cut into that space. So it's never going to want to sit flat. It's always going to want to sort of flip up and over and fight with you, and you can see all of the mistakes that have been made on this one here, all the places where there are little gaps. The line isn't perfectly straight. Well, this one's got just as much of a problem, if not more, and it hides it a lot better because those knots are consistent, and that's the first thing you see. It is the primary fill on top versus this, where you're seeing the carry, not the knot. This is the best I managed to do with that button thread. It's okay, and in a pinch, it would be fine if that's all that's available to you. It is really, really stiff. Like, it does not want to give. Because it is such a stiff thread, the knots don't compress nearly as much, so I can't get the threads as close together as I can on, say, something as fine as this type of thread. Even the version where I didn't use the canvas, you can see how much closer I can get the threads. It's about the same weight of thread, but it can just be so much more dense when you are working with something that actually compresses slightly. So this will always look a little spidery. I know in the darker thread it's particularly obvious, but it's never going to sit as flat and smooth as it will with silk thread. And in general, it's very, very stiff buttonhole as compared to the other options. So in a pinch, it'll do. It's just not going to be as finessed. I want to show you how to work with a cording next. So this first one that I did had a little bit of silk gimp that was laid down as I went around, and it gives it a little bit of an elevated appearance. It looks really clean and finished. When it comes to the final product, it also adds some strength. So there are different options that you've got for how you want to do this. You can get vintage or antique gimp that's specifically for buttonholes. In the case of the really heavy stuff like this, what you'll want to do is not actually stitch it through, but instead lay it down and stitch over it and then trim the ends off really close to where your stitching ends and then do the tack over the end. So it will be sitting loose in there, but you can't stitch this through fabric. Trust me on that. If you want something a little bit lighter weight, something you can stitch through fabric, the filament silk gimp that you can get from more modern companies, that's what I'll be showing today. You can also use a really heavy, say, silk embroidery, such as this one from Krennic, or something like a really heavy linen as well. The linen seems to be pretty popular historically as it is, but we don't need much. You can certainly do a longer thread if you're doing lots of buttons. You might want a larger needle for this as well, since it's kind of hard to thread through the smaller ones. So we're going to anchor it just like we did the other threads. Running it through, you may find that the casing sort of extends further off of the core, and so I like to leave a little bit of extra there, cut off the silk wrapping, and then we'll pop our way through. Again, we're going to be stitching over this, so anchoring it really tightly is not a big problem. You can either leave it attached over here to the needle, but I tend to find that that gets in my way pretty often, so I'll just leave it loose. I don't like to go ahead and stitch it into a loop because it can get kind of in the way and caught up, and I don't know what length I'm going to need just yet. So we're going to leave it like that first. For this example, I am going to go back to my thinner thread just so you can see the difference. You can do the button twist over this sort of cording as well. It just will give you a very prominent buttonhole. And all I'm trying to do is keep this angled so that the knots are sitting kind of on top of where the gimp is. It's not going to be perfect the whole way, but I'd rather start it off that way. And I generally find that if I have it pulled this way, it wants to slip off the edge really easily. If I have it straight, it sort of fights me the whole time. And if I keep it angled over here, it tends to fall about where I need it to. So you can run it like this, where you have a very dense stitch over the top and it's generally hiding the entire gimp. However, it's not uncommon that tailored goods will actually utilize the fact that the gimp is there and is matching and means that the buttonhole is strengthened. Some even use it as a sort of false buttonhole. Makes it much easier, so they'll actually end up spacing out the stitches pretty far. It still ends up looking really nice. You just need to make sure that the spacing is consistent, but it makes the stitching go much faster, but the buttonhole's not any weaker for it. As we go around the curve, it does have a tendency, just like the knots, to try and travel to the inside of that curve. That's okay. We're just trying to keep it up on top of the fabric rather than falling down inside. But you will end up seeing a little bit more of gimp when you go around that curve, just because the stitches will be more sparse. And once I get to the end here, usually where I will rethread, go back through, and anchor off by running between the layers, underneath the stitches, because there's a lot of tension there, and we're good to go. That's what it looks like, both the dense portion and the spaced portion. I admit I went a little fast there at the end, but you can see that's what it looks like when it's a bit more dense. And you can end up with a few different styles, or honestly a really quick and easy buttonhole that will, if it's not in contrasting thread, look very consistent and clean with very little work. If you are working with linen, like for a shirt, shift, other undergarments, this is where I will tend to do a buttonhole that has 2 bar tacks rather than rounding the corners, just because I like the cleaner look of it. Definitely not a keyhole though. We're going to be using a linen thread for this, and I will wax this thread. This is just plain beeswax. So we're going to be starting in the same way. The only difference being is that I'm not going to go ahead and start off by wrapping over the edges here. You can if you want to with a lighter weight thread. I find that it starts to get bulky really fast, particularly with this heavier weight. Honestly, this might be slightly heavier weight thread than I would want for this particular weight of linen. It's very fine linen, so this is as heavy as I would go. Because I don't have a canvas layer between everything, it does have an increased risk of pulling out, especially as I'm going straight across, which means that I'll have a very repeated number of threads being gripped in, and at any given time those, say, 5 threads could just pull off their loose ends. So that is something for me to be aware of and not pull to the side too heavily. Then at the first end, treat it just like it's the last end and go ahead and do the bar tack before moving on to the other side. So this is the finished linen buttonhole. I generally would go with a finer thread for this fine of a linen, but that happened to be the only white linen thread I had for some reason. So maybe choose accordingly depending on the weight of whatever you're working with. It still turned out okay. It would still function. It's just a little on the clunkier side. We can also do a completely closed or partially closed one as well. So for this, I'm going to use the really heavy gimp so you can see how that gets just laid down, and we'll go back to using the heavier button twist as well so we can see what that looks like with the gimp. It does mean it's a little bit harder for me to know exactly where I'm supposed to put that initial knot, but that's okay. We've found roughly where it needs to be. This is going to be done the same way that a regular buttonhole would, where we'll do the loop and we'll make the stitch. We'll just be going through that line as if there was an opening there, but I do want to lay the gimp on first. Depending on how thick your layers of fabric are, you might find that you don't end up going much through the back because of the angle that we're working at. That's okay. Usually there's just a tiny little pip at the back, so you won't see really big stitches. And you can definitely also do this where it's completely invisible in the back and you're really just going through the top layer and the canvas layer. That's perfectly fine as well. So if you need a buttonhole that's non-functional and only visible on one side, this is the ultimate way to do that. Once I turn the corner and start heading back, it can be a little bit difficult to get the needle into that space, especially if you're doing the really thick style that I'm doing with this heavy cord here and a heavy thread. So sometimes you have to angle everything sort of over and push your way in, and that might require you to sort of push the knot back over at the very end, but for right now it's okay that it's kind of shoved out of the way. When I get to this last stitch, this is when I will go in and cut both of the ends of the cord. Some examples, the cord stops actually just a little earlier than that, so don't be concerned about the ends making it all the way. And then, just like before, we will make a couple of bar tacks. We have what looks like a buttonhole on the face side and barely visible, or if you choose to, not visible at all on the back side. Blends in pretty well, and you can transition really easily from doing this style to an open style, so it doesn't matter. It's particularly great if you've got the really long ones that you only need a very small amount open for your button, but you want the really long styles of the 18th century, for example. The entire thing doesn't have to be open, just large enough to get your button through.